9 streets to avoid. What if the most dangerous thing about New York is not what happens in dark alleys, but what happens in plain sight, every single day, while everyone pretends nothing is wrong? New York sells itself as a city of safety, opportunity, and control, a global capital where cameras watch every corner and police presence suggests order. Yet beneath this carefully maintained image, there are streets that concentrate fear, tension, and instability in ways that travelers are never warned about. Streets where crossing from one block to the next feels less like tourism and more like entering a different social reality. This is where the myth of the modern metropolis begins to crack. These streets are not dangerous because of a single event or headline-grabbing crime. They are dangerous because danger has become normalized, because the warning signs are subtle, the broken lighting, the constant noise that never stops, the body language of people who walk faster, avoid eye contact, and keep their shoulders tense. The unspoken rules you only learn after you have already crossed the line. This is not chaos as spectacle. This is chaos as routine. Travel guides rarely talk about this side of New York. Movies do not show it. Social media filters it out. But locals feel it instantly. Certain streets operate as pressure points where economic exclusion, social neglect, and institutional fatigue collide. You can feel it in the air, in how businesses barricade themselves, in how public spaces feel hostile rather than welcoming, in how help feels far away, even when surrounded by millions of people. What makes these streets especially dangerous for travelers is not just crime statistics. It is misunderstanding. Tourists arrive believing New York works like a controlled system, where danger is isolated, predictable, and avoidable with common sense. But these streets do not announce themselves. They sit just outside polished neighborhoods. One wrong turn, one subway exit too early or too late, and the city changes tone completely. The glamour evaporates. The rules shift. This is where the illusion of safety collapses. Because danger here is structural, not accidental. It is the result of years of neglect, displacement, and social erosion that push risk into specific corridors while protecting others. These streets absorb what the rest of the city refuses to see, and the city keeps moving, pretending the problem is contained. Understanding these streets is not about fear. It is about awareness. Because once you recognize how New York hides its most unstable zones in plain sight, you start to see the city differently. And what comes next raises an even more uncomfortable question. If this is allowed to exist here, in the most powerful city on earth, what does that say about the real state of urban life today? If this opening already made you question what you thought you knew about New York, take a moment to pause and really process. What is being revealed here? Understanding how danger, neglect, and illusion coexist in the same urban space is not just curiosity, it is essential awareness. These patterns affect travelers, residents, and anyone who still believes the myth of the perfectly controlled modern city. Leave a comment sharing your first reaction to this reality. Did this align with what you expected, or did it challenge your perception of New York? Your perspective matters because these conversations only exist when people are willing to look beyond the surface. If this analysis is helping you see the city through a sharper lens, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. What we are about to uncover goes even deeper into how these streets became what they are. What turns an ordinary street into a place people instinctively avoid is rarely a single moment of violence. It is repetition. It is the slow accumulation of signals that something is off, that the rules people rely on elsewhere no longer apply here. In New York, some streets reach a point where danger is no longer shocking. It becomes routine. Locals stop reacting. Sirens blend into background noise. Arguments spill into sidewalks without drawing attention. This is when a street crosses an invisible threshold from unstable to normalized chaos. For someone visiting the city, this is extremely dangerous precisely because nothing looks dramatic at first glance. Buildings still stand. Stores are still open. Trains still run nearby. But the atmosphere changes. People move differently. Conversations are sharper, louder, more defensive. There is an underlying tension that never fully dissipates. It is the feeling of a place that has been abandoned socially, even if it still exists economically. These streets are often positioned between two realities. On one side, neighborhoods marketed as vibrant, creative, or revitalized. On the other, areas carrying the weight of decades of displacement, underinvestment, and exhaustion. The street itself becomes a buffer zone, absorbing conflict. This is where homelessness concentrates, not by accident, but because services are inconsistent and enforcement is selective. It is where informal economies thrive because formal ones no longer offer access. It is where frustration has nowhere left to go, but outward. What makes this especially dangerous for travelers is timing. The same street can feel merely uncomfortable during the day and deeply threatening at night. Lighting gaps matter. Storefronts closing early matter. Transit delays matter. When fewer people are around, the social contract weakens further. Witnesses disappear. Intervention becomes unlikely, and the sense that no one is truly in control becomes overwhelming. There is also a psychological trap. Many travelers believe confidence is protection. They think walking fast, looking determined, or acting local will keep them safe. But on streets where chaos is normalized, confidence can be misread. Eye contact can escalate situations. Hesitation can attract attention. Even stopping to check a phone can signal vulnerability. The street is not reacting to you personally. It is reacting to pressure. This normalization of danger is one of the clearest signs of urban decay. Not collapse as explosion, but collapse as routine. When residents stop expecting safety, institutions stop being held accountable. When institutions disengage, streets decay faster. It is a self-reinforcing cycle that rarely makes headlines because nothing appears to be happening. And yet, something is happening every day. This raises a critical question as we move forward. How did New York allow certain streets to reach a point where instability feels ordinary, and who benefits from keeping it that way? What most travelers never realize is that some of the most dangerous streets in New York are not hidden in remote corners of the city. They exist right next to places designed to feel safe, exciting, and familiar. This proximity is not accidental. It is structural. These streets sit just outside the curated zones where tourists spend money, take photos, and consume the illusion of control. Step a few blocks beyond that boundary, and the city stops performing. This is where invisible violence lives, not always as an explosion of crime, but as constant pressure. Verbal confrontations that escalate quickly. Territorial behavior that signals who belongs and who does not. Predatory awareness directed at anyone who looks lost, distracted, or unfamiliar. To a visitor, it may look like nothing is happening. To someone who lives nearby, the signals are unmistakable. The danger here is not just physical, it is social. These streets operate under a different set of expectations because they have been quietly excluded from protection. Police presence becomes reactive instead of preventive. Businesses invest in barriers instead of improvement. Residents learn to minimize their exposure rather than demand change. Over time, the street develops its own survival logic, one that outsiders do not understand until it is too late. Tourists are especially vulnerable because they rely on visual cues that no longer apply. Bright lights nearby create a false sense of security. The sound of traffic suggests activity and oversight. The presence of people suggests safety in numbers. But on these streets, crowds do not function as protection. They function as cover. Incidents happen quickly and dissolve into movement. Accountability disappears into density. Another critical factor is misinterpretation. Travelers often mistake poverty for danger and miss the real warning signs. The true indicators are behavioral. How quickly conversations turn confrontational. How people scan their surroundings. How storefronts fortify themselves. How public space feels claimed rather than shared. These are signs of a street under strain, where social trust has eroded. What makes this especially disturbing is how normalized it has become. These streets are treated as unavoidable collateral damage of urban life. as if a global city must sacrifice certain corridors to keep others functioning smoothly. The danger is not denied outright. It is simply managed, displaced, and reframed as someone else's problem. This is the point where the narrative shifts from individual risk to systemic failure. Because when a city allows invisible violence to persist next, to its most profitable zones, it reveals a priority structure that favors image over safety. And once you see that pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it. One of the clearest warnings that a street has crossed into dangerous territory is not crime itself, but infrastructure failure. In New York, infrastructure is supposed to signal power, wealth, and permanence. When that system starts to decay in specific corridors, it is never random. Flickering streetlights, broken sidewalks, unreliable transit access, and neglected sanitation are not just inconveniences. They are signals that oversight has withdrawn. On these streets, darkness matters. Poor lighting creates pockets where visibility collapses, altering behavior instantly. People cluster near the few illuminated areas or move with urgency through shadowed blocks. This changes how space is used. Corners become contested. Doorways become temporary shelters or observation points. The street stops being neutral ground and starts operating as fragmented territory. Public transportation plays a major role in this shift. When subway entrances feel unsafe, elevators break down, or buses become unpredictable, streets absorb the tension. Missed connections force people to wait longer in exposed areas. Delays concentrate frustration. Over time, the street itself becomes the pressure valve for a system that no longer functions smoothly. Travelers feel this immediately, even if they cannot articulate why. There is also the issue of maintenance as messaging. Clean streets communicate presence, neglected streets communicate abandonment. Trash accumulation, graffiti layered over old graffiti, and unrepaired damage tell residents and outsiders the same thing. No one is watching closely anymore. That perception alone changes behavior. Opportunistic crime becomes easier. Aggression feels less risky. Intervention feels less likely. What makes this especially troubling is how selective the decay is. Just a few blocks away, infrastructure may be pristine. Cameras function. Lighting is uniform. Streets are washed regularly. The contrast exposes a deliberate prioritization. Certain streets are allowed to degrade because they are no longer considered valuable in the same way. Value is measured economically, not humanly. For travelers, this creates a dangerous illusion. Infrastructure decay does not announce itself as danger. It presents as inconvenience. A dark block here, a delayed train there. But when these elements stack together, they create environments where risk multiplies quietly. The street becomes less predictable, less regulated, and less forgiving of mistakes. This is how danger embeds itself structurally, not through chaos, but through neglect layered over time. And once infrastructure stops protecting people, the burden of safety shifts entirely onto the individual. It is unsettling to realize that some of the most dangerous streets in New York exist inside one of the richest cities on Earth. This is the geography of fear, and it exposes a contradiction the city rarely confronts. Wealth here does not eliminate danger, it redistributes it. Risk is pushed, compressed, and concentrated into specific corridors so that other areas can continue to function as symbols of success and stability. These streets are not accidents of poverty, they are products of exclusion. Housing costs force lower-income residents into shrinking zones, services thin out, public attention fades. What remains is a street carrying pressures it was never designed to handle alone. Over time, fear becomes spatial. People learn where not to walk, when not to pass, which side of the street to choose. Survival becomes a form of local knowledge. For outsiders, this geography is invisible. Maps do not show it. Apps do not warn about it. The city's wealth creates a false expectation that danger is controlled everywhere. But control is selective. Resources follow money, tourism, and image. Streets that do not contribute to the narrative of prosperity are allowed to absorb instability so the rest of the city can appear functional. This creates an emotional contradiction. You can stand on a street surrounded by luxury apartments, high-end stores, and global brands, yet feel unsafe within minutes. The contrast is disorienting. Wealth does not soften the environment. It sharpens it. Inequality becomes visible in behavior, not architecture. Tension surfaces in how people protect themselves, how quickly conflicts escalate, how little patience remains. What is most disturbing is how normalized this arrangement has become. Fear is treated as a personal problem instead of a structural one. If a street feels unsafe, the assumption is that you should avoid it, adapt, or leave. The city does not ask why that street became dangerous in the first place. Avoidance replaces accountability. For travelers, this is a critical misunderstanding. Danger here is not about being in a poor area. It is about being in a pressure zone, a place where economic forces, social neglect, and human exhaustion collide. These streets exist because the city prioritizes growth over balance, image over cohesion, and profit over livability. And this leads to a deeper realization that changes how you see New York entirely. Fear is not a failure of the city. It is part of how the city now organizes itself. For many travelers, danger in New York does not come from reckless behavior or obvious mistakes. It comes from crossing invisible lines without realizing they exist. These lines are not marked by signs, barriers, or warnings. They are social boundaries, created by shifts in behavior, surveillance, and tolerance. A street that feels acceptable during the afternoon can transform into a high-risk environment within an hour, and visitors are often the last to notice. Tourists rely heavily on timing assumptions. They believe crowds mean safety, that busy streets are controlled streets. But in certain parts of New York, crowds thin suddenly and unpredictably. Stores close earlier than expected. Transit frequency drops. Security presence disappears. What remains is a street that was never designed to be empty, now operating without witnesses. This is when risk multiplies. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time is not bad luck here. It is structural exposure. Travelers step off a subway exit because it is closer to their destination, unaware that locals avoid that exit after a certain hour. They follow navigation apps that optimize distance, not safety. They assume consistency when the city functions in fragments. One block can be radically different from the next. What makes this especially dangerous is hesitation. Visitors slow down to orient themselves. They check phones. They stop walking to confirm directions. On streets under pressure, hesitation is read as vulnerability, not because people are inherently predatory, but because stress sharpens awareness. The street reacts to uncertainty. There is also a psychological trap at play. Many travelers believe that confidence will protect them. They walk faster, stand straighter, try to project control. But in unstable zones, confidence without context can escalate interactions rather than diffuse them. A glance can be interpreted as a challenge. Avoidance can be read as fear. The social codes are different, and outsiders do not know them. These situations are rarely discussed because they are uncomfortable. They challenge the idea that cities operate under universal rules. In reality, New York is a mosaic of micro-environments, each governed by its own pressures. When travelers cross those environments without understanding the underlying stress, they become exposed not just to crime, but to unpredictability. This is where the illusion of urban mastery collapses. The belief that experience, money, or intelligence alone can navigate any city. In New York, survival often depends on local awareness, not confidence, and travelers do not have time to develop it. What often goes unspoken in conversations about dangerous streets is who gets trapped near them. These areas do not just endanger travelers, they concentrate risk around people who no longer have the option to leave. As rents rise and neighborhoods are rebranded, long-term residents are pushed outward, block by block, until they reach streets where investment stops and pressure accumulates. This is not sudden displacement. It is slow confinement. These streets become holding zones. People remain not because they want to, but because every alternative has been priced out of reach. Housing instability forces constant movement within shrinking boundaries. Jobs are farther away, commutes become longer and more exhausting, stress compounds daily. Over time, the street absorbs frustration, despair, and survival behavior. Risk becomes a shared condition. What makes this especially dangerous is density, without support. As wealthier populations are filtered elsewhere, services follow them. Mental health resources thin out. Social programs become overwhelmed. Enforcement becomes inconsistent. The street is left to manage human crisis informally. Conflicts escalate faster because everyone is already operating at the edge of tolerance. For visitors, this dynamic is invisible. A dangerous street appears threatening in isolation. In reality, it is the endpoint of a sorting process. New York does not eliminate instability. It redistributes it geographically. Certain streets are allowed to carry disproportionate human cost so that others can maintain an image of order and progress. This creates a moral distortion. Danger is framed as a local failure rather than a citywide consequence. Residents who remain near these streets are blamed for their proximity, not recognized as victims of systemic exclusion. Over time, empathy erodes. Avoidance replaces engagement. Silence becomes policy. The result is a street that feels abandoned not just physically, but socially. When people sense that no one is advocating for them, self-protection becomes the dominant logic. Trust collapses. Suspicion rises. Outsiders feel it immediately, even if they cannot explain why the atmosphere feels so heavy. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about New York's decline. The city's prosperity depends on concentrating instability where it is least visible. Dangerous streets are not anomalies. They are byproducts of a system that prioritizes growth while quietly expelling those who no longer fit the narrative. Living near streets defined by constant danger reshapes the human mind in ways that statistics never capture. This is not just about fear of crime, it is about permanent alertness. People learn to scan faces automatically, to memorize escape routes, to adjust their pace without thinking. Over time, this hypervigilance becomes the default mental state. The street does not turn off, and neither do the people who live around it. This psychological load is exhausting. Residents sleep lightly. Small noises trigger stress responses. Ordinary interactions feel charged. When your environment signals threat every day, the body adapts by staying tense, and that tension slowly erodes emotional stability. Anxiety becomes normalized. Irritability becomes survival. Empathy shrinks because there is no energy left to spare. What makes these streets uniquely damaging is the absence of recovery. In healthier environments, stress comes in waves. Here, it is constant. The nervous system never resets. People move from home to work to transit without ever feeling fully safe. Over months and years, this leads to burnout that looks like apathy, aggression, or withdrawal. Outsiders often misinterpret this as hostility when it is actually fatigue. For travelers, this psychological atmosphere is palpable even if they cannot name it. Conversations feel abrupt. People avoid eye contact. Help feels transactional rather than human. The street feels emotionally cold even when crowded. This is not because people are cruel. It is because trust has become a liability. The danger is that this mental strain spreads. Children raised near these streets internalize threat early. They learn that the world is unpredictable and unforgiving. Their baseline expectations are shaped by instability. This is how urban decline reproduces itself across generations, quietly and efficiently. What is rarely acknowledged is that this psychological cost is part of the city's infrastructure failure. Streets are not just physical spaces, they are emotional ecosystems. When those ecosystems are saturated with fear, the damage outlasts any single incident. It becomes cultural, it becomes normalized, and this leads to an uncomfortable realization. Some of the most dangerous streets in New York do not just harm bodies, they reshape minds. And once that happens, reversing, decline becomes far more difficult than repairing pavement or adding police patrols. Despite everything happening on these streets, one of the most powerful forces keeping them dangerous is silence, not ignorance, but denial. New York does not lack data, reports, or awareness. What it lacks is collective willingness to admit that certain problems are no longer temporary. They are structural. Acknowledging that would mean admitting that the system designed to manage urban life is failing in visible human ways. Institutions respond by reframing. Dangerous streets become challenging corridors. Instability becomes transition. Violence is discussed in percentages rather than experiences. This language creates distance. It allows officials, media, and even residents to talk around the problem without confronting its impact on daily life. The streets remain the same, but the narrative softens the damage. Culturally, denial operates as protection. New York's identity is built on resilience, toughness, and reinvention. Admitting decline feels like betrayal. People are encouraged to normalize the abnormal, to adapt, to cope, to accept higher stress as the cost of ambition. Over time, expectations collapse quietly. What would have been unacceptable a decade ago becomes routine. For travelers, this denial is dangerous. They arrive believing the official story. They trust infrastructure, branding, and reputation. When something feels wrong, they doubt themselves rather than the city. That hesitation delays response. By the time they recognize risk, they are already exposed. There is also an unspoken fear behind the silence. If these streets are acknowledged as failures, the illusion of control breaks. The idea that wealth, policing, and technology can fully manage urban complexity dissolves. It becomes clear that some problems cannot be optimized away. They require uncomfortable choices about inequality, density, and human limits. This is why denial persists. It is easier to pretend danger is isolated than to admit it is systemic. Easier to treat dangerous streets as anomalies than as symptoms. But every ignored street becomes precedent. Each one signals that decline can exist without consequence, as long as it stays contained. The normalization of danger is the final stage of urban erosion. When fear no longer shocks, reform loses urgency. The city keeps functioning, but something essential has already broken. By the time we reach the most dangerous streets in New York, the problem is no longer about avoiding a wrong turn or memorizing which blocks to skip. It is about what these streets reveal when viewed together. They form a pattern, a map of stress, exclusion, and institutional retreat etched into the city's daily life. This is not random decay. It is organized neglect. These streets function as pressure release zones. They absorb the consequences of policies and economic forces that are celebrated elsewhere. While certain neighborhoods are polished, protected, and marketed as global success stories, others are quietly allowed to fracture. The city continues to operate, but only by concentrating instability where it is least visible to those with power or mobility. What makes this deeply unsettling is how ordinary it has become. There is no single moment when the city collapses, no dramatic failure that forces accountability. Instead, danger becomes background noise. People learn routes that minimize exposure. Visitors are told to be careful without being told why. Life continues inside shrinking margins of safety. For travelers, these streets deliver the most brutal lesson about the modern city. That reputation does not equal reality. That wealth does not guarantee protection. That control is often an illusion maintained by displacement. Crossing one of these streets is not just a physical risk. It is a confrontation with the limits of urban promise. For residents, the cost is heavier. Living near. These streets means carrying constant vigilance, emotional exhaustion, and reduced trust. It means adapting to instability while being told everything is fine. Over time, this erodes not only safety, but belonging. The city stops feeling like a shared project and starts feeling like a system you must survive. And this is the question New York forces us to ask. If the city that symbolizes ambition, opportunity, and modern life cannot protect its own streets, what does that say about the future of large urban centers everywhere? If you stayed until the end of this video, It means you are willing to look past the surface and confront a reality most people prefer to ignore. That awareness matters. Cities do not change when myths are protected. They change when people are willing to understand what is really happening beneath the image. If this analysis helped you see New York through a more honest lens, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next breakdown. Leave a like if you believe understanding urban decline is essential to navigating modern life. And in the comments, write the phrase, "I saw the cracks," so I know you reached the end and stayed with the truth. Now, watch the next video appearing on your screen. What we uncover there will connect directly to everything you just saw here.